Good afternoon. So I'm Emily Lutz, the president of the Nova Scotia Federation of Municipalities, those of you who may not know me. And thank you so much for joining us today on this beautiful January Thursday. I think we're back to knowing the days of the week. So I believe it is Thursday. We'll say it is anyway. So I'd like to take a moment before we begin to acknowledge our NSFM staff that are here with us today. Wendy Dispenser, our CEO, apologies, habits, and Judy Weber and Debbie Nielsen are also here. So welcome. So today we've gathered, in a sense, to hear from Danny Graham, the CEO of Engage Nova Scotia, and Deputy Minister Bernie Miller from the Department of Business with the province of Nova Scotia. And they're presenting today on the results from the Nova Scotia Quality of Life Survey. And not to give away any spoilers, you've probably heard of it already, but the Quality of Life Initiative has really stemmed from the desire to have important dialogue about how we can make better decisions and build a society around the things that Nova Scotians really value. And I think what these gentlemen are going to do this morning is to sort of tie this into a paradigm shift across the province regarding an openness to change and an embracing of progress. But you'll see for yourself when they start. So specifically, I think this morning for all of you here, I think it will be helpful to listen sort of with a municipal lens and ponder how we might accept and use this type of data from the Quality of Life Initiative to inform decision-making in our own communities and moving forward on that type of thing. So today you're going to hear about the findings from the survey and learn the ways that your municipality can access additional results. And just the technical piece, there will be a question and answer following the presentation. So we would ask that you hold your questions until the end. And then I think we'll have them moderated by Judy, and she will be, you can actually speak them. You don't have to use the chat function, although I think you can if you wish. Am I correct in saying that, Judy? Was that what we decided?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. We'd like to hear from you. I think we'd like to see your wonderful shining faces speaking your questions so we can feel like a little bit more connected to each other. So with that, I will now turn it over to Danny and Deputy Minister. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Emily and Danny. If you can get the slide started, I'll get us going. Really appreciate everyone taking the time for this this conversation. And in addition to it being a sunny Thursday, it will be the first full day of what historians will call the post-Trump era. And I want to talk about the future, the next 10 years. And I'm mindful of Yogi Berra, who once said, it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. But I am going to venture one, and that is that quality of life will be a key driver of economic growth and social well-being, certainly over the next 10 years. And I'll try to back up that statement in this presentation. So here we are at the beginning of 2021, a lot of dynamic changes, some of it accelerated by the pandemic, and some of it was brewing under the surface, some good, some bad. And I think it's a really opportune time for us to have this conversation about quality of life, and then look at the data that Danny will have to give us some on-the-ground perspectives of how it looks across Nova Scotia in our various functional economic regions, which are depicted on this slide. Go to the next slide. One key point, and Emily, you mentioned, think about this in the context of municipalities and municipal roles. There's another old adage that generals are always preparing for the last war. And I think we need to be ready for the new era that is, I think, well underway. And in the past, when we talked about economic growth and social progress, we often kind of separated them into different spheres. And at the municipal level, economic growth was often put under the context of investment readiness. Have your community ready for attracting and establishing businesses, usually from away. That was usually the context. But it was very much enterprise focused, not human centered and people focused. For the next 10 years, I think the more effective and higher return effort will be having your municipalities focused on population readiness. And by that, we mean housing and transit and community and active transit, investing in public places, aging well in community, and having family-friendly communities. And I'll get into why I think that's going to be far more important than the old paradigm of investment readiness. So we'll go to the next slide. When I talked about generals fighting the last war, if we look at the period between October of 2011 and October or April of 2015, you can see why the Ivany commissioners were alarmed. The population was declining. Young people were leaving. There was a historic pattern of people between the ages of 18 and 34 leaving the province because there were better opportunities elsewhere, or that was always the perception. It was focused on economic factors. And if we establish our policies and our program initiatives based on the circumstances that existed between 2011 and 2015, we're going to miss both some dynamic changes in Nova Scotia, but also some factors happening in the global economy, which are really changing the factors of production, what drives economic growth and what drives well-being. And more, I think we shouldn't separate those two concepts into distinct spheres. Social well-being and economic growth are two sides of the same coin. When we look at this pattern in Nova Scotia, there is a definitive shift in 2015. I was always cautious when speaking about population growth, not to rely on a single year as being evident of a trend. But now we have 5 years of measurable population growth. And I would very quickly say that each functional economic region in Nova Scotia, each functional economic region is experiencing positive interprovincial in-migration. And what we've noticed in 2019, 2020, and I think you've all probably experienced it in your communities, is the pandemic has had the effect of accelerating interprovincial migration into Nova Scotia. So that's one of the reasons I think it's important to not fight, but be prepared for the next era rather than fight the last war, which was a declining, aging, and shrinking population, which brought its own challenges. A growing population brings challenges as well, but done well, it can improve quality of life and social well-being in the long run. So I want to mention that this slide also has a little glimpse of our past, and I always look to the history of Nova Scotia for lessons for the future. And the picture is of Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, around 1880. And in 1880, Yarmouth, Nova Scotia had more registered tonnage of ships than any port on the eastern seaboard. Their shipping was the equivalent of the entire country of Norway. One of the world leaders in shipping, but technology changed, and we were on the wrong side of technological change at that time. Within a decade or two, it happened that there was what we would characterize as economic migration. A lot of people left Yarmouth. In fact, most of the carpenters in Boston, or certainly a high percentage of the carpenters in Boston at the turn of the century, were former shipbuilders, former craftspeople that were building ships, not just in Yarmouth, but all around the ports of Nova Scotia. They had to leave for economic reasons, economic migration to pursue a better quality of life. In the new era, we have remote work, we have cloud-based computing, we have distributed workforces, we have disaggregation of work, we have a re-emergence of craft and craft-based opportunities and new concepts of economies of scale, which it's not the same driver that it would have been during the industrial era. And what I think we're seeing in Nova Scotia over the last 5 years is a new category of migration, which I would call lifestyle migration. It's partly economic, but mostly people are moving because they perceive they can achieve better quality of life. And this next slide provides evidence that this is not an urban phenomenon solely. Obviously, Halifax has seen the benefit of this. 2.1% growth rate this year puts it at the second highest in Canada in terms of urban growth. but it's not either or. Rural Nova Scotia is experiencing growth as well. I picked this particular data point from 2017 because we had good data to show in-migration into rural Nova Scotia, rural and small town Nova Scotia in a particular year, and it's pre-pandemic. And this excludes Halifax, it excludes Cape Breton Regional Municipality, it excludes Kentville, New Glasgow, Truro. So this is trying to capture smaller communities. And what we're seeing here, and this is a bit of a busy slide, but what it shows is to rural Nova Scotia, there was a gain of 4,861 people in that single year. And what we've been able to show is where did those people come from? And if we start in the West Coast, we can see 148 people from Vancouver and Victoria. Up in the northern part of Alberta, you've got the repatriated Fort McMurray residents, only 269. When people think about our population growth, they tend to think, okay, everyone came back from Alberta all at once, but that doesn't show in the data. Obviously, 269 is not an insignificant number, but that's not the sole driver of it. Edmonton, Calgary, likewise, large numbers. A smaller amount from Saskatchewan. Surprisingly, Winnipeg, Manitoba, 86 people moving into rural Nova Scotia, but then 834 from the Toronto area, 407 from the Ottawa area, and so forth. So we see this urban to rural shift and a rural to rural shift, which could be the beginning of a trend. Time will tell, but it's certainly, I think, perhaps early evidence of lifestyle migration. So if we can go to the next slide, I want to talk about the Ivany report a little bit. When the Ivany report did their work, they were talking about the risk to community, the risk to the province of continued out-migration. And they spoke about when people leave, to a very serious extent, they take the future of their communities with them. And that's really the call to action, the urgent circumstances that existed in 2014. And I thought I'd give a few examples, because not only when people leave do they take the future of their communities with them, sometimes the community itself withers and dies. But the converse is also true. When you have positive in-migration, when you have people coming to your community, when you have people staying in your community, the prospects of entrepreneurial activity and new wealth creation is certainly possible. I'll very quickly go through these three interesting examples. They were interesting to me anyway. I hope they're interesting to you. There is a place in Pictou County called Millsville. Right now, it's essentially a dot on the map with no real community. But back at the turn of the century, Millsville had 2 grist mills, sawmills, a store, a church, a hospital, a community. It was a thriving village in rural Nova Scotia. However, at the turn of the century, our opportunities started to decline, and a man named Alexander Willis, who lived in Millsville, was interested in pursuing a livelihood in the piano retail and manufacturing business. And off he went to Montreal. And decades later, Willis Pianos is still around. Willis Pianos is now based in Germany with a major presence in China. And it's one of the top global brands for high quality pianos from an entrepreneur from Millsville, Nova Scotia. Alfred Fuller from Wellsford, Nova Scotia, left around the same time as Willis, maybe a little bit later, left with $70 in his pocket and went to Hartford, Connecticut in pursuit of opportunity. And he ultimately started the Fuller Brush Company. The Fuller Brush Company in 1923 had the largest factory in the world based in Hartford, Connecticut. And ultimately, 2 Hollywood movies were made about Fuller Brush, and it became a household name and a household brand. So this is not to bemoan the loss of these entrepreneurs, but emphasize how entrepreneurs staying in community can build the future of the community, just as when they leave, they can take the future with them. The final and probably most intriguing one to me was Anna Sutherland Bissell from Riverjohn, Nova Scotia. She broke the glass ceiling in the United States. She was the first CEO of a major corporation in the United States in 1899. She and her husband had founded a crockery and china company. And so she was an entrepreneur from an early stage. She was an active participant in the business. And she noticed that they had their shop connected to their house, and the dust from their crockery business would accumulate in the carpets. So she and her husband innovated and developed the carpet sweeper. And the Bissell Broom Company emerged from that. And the Bissell Company is still around today with about 1,000 employees and annual sales of about $800 million. But the intriguing factor is, one, it was a Nova Scotian who broke the glass ceiling in the US. It's taken a long time to make further progress since then. But it really is an interesting tale of the entrepreneurial capacity of Nova Scotians, because part of the counter narrative, or the narrative that built up in the Ivany era, was that we weren't entrepreneurial, but absolutely we are. In fact, we're innovative and we have lots of innovation capacity. So people coming into the province will increase our entrepreneurial innovation capacity. Going to the next slide, the other thing that's different about this era compared to the previous era is capital is mobile. It will go to where the ideas are and where the opportunities are. In the industrial age, capital had to be invested in fixed assets like power companies and pulp and paper factories and transportation facilities and newspaper establishments and so on and so forth. And yet another Nova Scotian, Isaac Walton Killam, and his wife Dorothy Killam from Yarmouth, were pretty good at that, in the sense that Isaac and Dorothy in the 30s and 40s would have been the most wealthy people in Canada. Isaac Killam was a very shy, retiring person, so he didn't seek a lot of publicity. But in the industrial age, he was Canada's leading financier. And the picture in the slide is just, I think, evidence of how successful they were as financiers. That's La Leopolde in the south of France, which was the house that they owned in the south of France. And it ultimately was owned by the heir to the Grand Marnier fortune, who then sold it in 2016 for 1 billion euros, which would make it the most expensive home in the world. So Isaac did pretty well. And in his death, he left a large legacy in philanthropy for post-secondary research. So that the key point in kind of highlighting him is another Nova Scotian with great capacity, but had to leave. Had he had the opportunity to stay, likely would have, as everyone would have. But the other key point here is capital is no longer in fixed assets. It's in ideas and in intangibles. So we'll go to the next slide. Innovation and change. I used the Yarmouth example, but being on the right side of innovation and change could change the trajectory of our communities. Technological change can lead to economic decline, as it did in Yarmouth, but it also can lead to economic growth and opportunity. And in the last several years, our focus on our comparative advantages all across our functional economic regions have enabled us to focus time and attention on those things that will grow the economy. And so we'll go to the next slide, Danny. The key kind of theme is, it's a bit of a hypothesis, but supported by evidence, that we're really at the start of a new era where the ideas and intangible economy will be supplementing our existing traditional economy in agriculture and fisheries and forestry, areas where Nova Scotia has had a historic presence, but we'll also be supplementing that with new ideas and new opportunities. And the pandemic has had an interesting effect. Some of my colleagues used the phrase, the future arrived 10 years early with the pandemic, and our ability to continue to function in a remote and distributed way has created a significant opportunity for Nova Scotia, which will survive and extend beyond the pandemic by all indications. So the factors of production are no longer fixed assets, and it's no longer unskilled labor in abundance, and it's no longer really land-based. Land, labor, and capital was the historic drivers of economic growth. The key factor of production now is knowledge, skills, and quality of place and quality of life. So that's my case anyway on why I think over the next 10 years, one, Nova Scotia has great advantages, but two, our investment in quality of place and quality of life becomes an economic investment, as well as a social well-being investment. So going to the next slide, what we've got is this basic theme that we should keep in mind. Innovation-driven entrepreneurship and population growth are two sides of the same coin. By attracting and keeping people in community with livable, family-friendly, accessible communities with good transit and access to outdoor activities is a good investment for innovation-driven entrepreneurship. Next slide. The Ivany report, and Danny alluded to us speaking about this this morning in our prep session, and we said the Ivany report was phenomenal in getting us ahead of the curve, recognizing the risks of staying on the same path and the opportunities of changing paths. And we've seen it in the population data that by having a collaborative province-wide effort, we can change our trajectory. And really, I think the next 10 years is about what comes next, and a focus on quality of life and well-being is likely, if my hypothesis holds in any way, going to be much more a significant factor of what drives our future. Next slide. We've actually had, I think, some tangible evidence of how a human-centered focus on well-being can produce positive economic and social outcomes in the global pandemic. Nova Scotia and our Atlantic confreres have really been the most successful jurisdictions in certainly the Western Hemisphere, if not the world, in containing the COVID virus and protecting people. And in doing this, our success was measured not in economic or fiscal terms, not in GDP growth or fiscal balances. We instinctively measured our success primarily in human terms, in keeping people safe, healthy, and protecting well-being. So that microcosm of the last 10 months, I think, is an illustration of how a focus on well-being will also, it's not contradictory to economic growth. We've had a better economic recovery and we've had better economic numbers, not in every sector. Obviously, tourism has been hit more than any other sector, but our retail numbers bounced back quicker than other jurisdictions because of the early work done to make sure that we protected people. Likewise, although every jurisdiction has spent lots of money responding to COVID, our fiscal position is better as a result of the containment. So good health policy is good economic policy. Focusing on people and taking a human-centered approach will set us on a better path for the future. And before I pass it off to Danny, I just wanted to have one final slide to give some indications on the next slide of the areas that historically might have been considered social policy, but I believe they're truly now combined social and economic policy. And these are, some of them are very much in the wheelhouse of what municipalities do. Obviously, it's a collaborative issue with provincial. We need to be aligned on these things. But community and active transit, having appropriate infrastructure, both hard and social infrastructure, having an inclusive approach to what we do, focusing on skills and learning and being able to be receptive to in-migration without disrupting what makes our communities so positive. This board, it's not all inclusive, but the concept here is there are things that traditionally would have been compartmentalized as social policy. They're really economic policy. And by measuring our success, not in GDP terms, not that GDP is not important, but if the measure of success is only GDP growth, then the United States has been a dramatically successful jurisdiction. Everything I've seen over the last 4 years tells me that's not the case. So measuring success in GDP terms leads to an identifiable path, but measuring success beyond GDP to how quality of life is improved creates new opportunities and new paths. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to my colleague and friend, Danny.
You're going to have to unmute there, Danny. Sorry. There you go.
There you go. I was feeling, this is quite a slingshot, because I was feeling quite proud after having learned that I was the person who created that red mark. I managed to find the eraser for it, and that pride actually came back to bite me, no doubt, when I couldn't even unmute myself, which is a pretty common thing these days. Anyway, it's wonderful to see everybody on this call. I checked the registration beforehand. Thanks, Judy, for sharing that. And we were delighted to see so many familiar faces, but also some new faces, and that every region that would be from those functional economic regions that Bernie had shown and we're going to talk about is represented in this conversation. As Emily said at the beginning, this is ultimately about decision-making in your communities. What does the high level and historical piece have to do with the choices that you and your councils and the RENs have to have in front of you? And what I'm going to do in the time that I have, this will probably take about a half hour or so, and leaving in the range of a half hour for questions and conversation. That's what I'm hoping for, is to give you some a quick sense of what the initiative is about, what's possible within the initiative, and how you access results, and some early findings, particularly some findings that are most relevant from a municipal and REN perspective. And then I'd like to, at the very end, bring it back up to that larger question that Bernie was asking about, along the lines of, so what? We are Nova Scotians. Is there something unique about these times that are especially suited to us in as the world continues to change quite dramatically right now? For those of you who aren't familiar, I'm putting up this slide in part because it does have an historical context. As Bernie often points out, dating back almost 100 years, we've been writing reports about the future of Nova Scotia. And the things that we've predominantly focused on are the visible challenges we've had and continue to have had around economic and demographic progress. We need to continue to be vigilant in those regards. But we also know, as Nova Scotians, that metaphorically, you can't plant a good seed into bad soil. And it is often the social, cultural, environmental, and democratic elements of the less seen things in our society that need to be better understood in order for us to foster those things that make our lives ultimately better. So we are fortunate to be part of a large network of people who have helped us in both raising awareness about this particular work. You'll see that this is just a snapshot. Some of you who have been supporters may not see your municipal or REN logos up there. And it's only because this was what we captured almost 2 years ago when we started down the road of this initiative. And I want to say at this time how grateful we are for the massive involvement of those many partners. None of this would have been possible if it weren't for the trust and collaboration that we've been able to work with our many partners around the province. So I'm going to touch on this slide a couple of times in my presentation, but let me just start by describing it in its most basic terms. Almost 80,000 households received a randomly selected 230 question survey asking questions that were intended to get us deeper into an understanding of the well-being of Nova Scotians. When we spoke to a polling company about what kind of a response we would get, they said, 230 questions, you're probably going to have about a 2% response rate. Turns out that we had more than 16% of the households who received this respond, making this the largest quality of life well-being data set, at least in North America, maybe anywhere, based on the conversations that we've been having. And coming out of the pandemic, it gives us information that no other jurisdiction in Canada or anywhere that we know of has, to sort of build back from an understanding that really reflects essentially the first voice of 12,800 Nova Scotians who said, this is important to me, these are my lived experiences, on results that have a margin of error of less than 1%. We have 9 local leadership teams, and some of you are part of those local leadership teams. Can't say enough about expressing our appreciation for what you've done. But they can't act alone. And while it is in most of the regions representative of a broad group of people, every one of them would welcome the support and commitment of the municipalities in their regions to be actively involved in this sort of work. So if I were to leave you with anything, it is that this is essentially a setup conversation for a conversation that we'd love to have in each of the regions that are depicted here, because as the research shows, the number of responses in every region give us the ability to understand every region. I'll touch on that just a little bit more. What's important to remember from all of our perspectives is that this is so often you get reports and it sits on shelves. And the Ivany report broke the mold in that it continues to have resonance with Nova Scotians, as Bernie was saying. It is an act of something. And from our perspective, this too is not just a measurement exercise, it's a change initiative. But with that many results, there's a huge logistical challenge for us, and it relates to bringing these results to Nova Scotians. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit right now is essentially related to how we reach people, how do we reveal what's possible, and how we make the results available to everyday Nova Scotians. Throughout the fall and now through the winter, we are engaging leaders in all of the sectors that are indicated on the slide that's in front of you. This, of course, is we've always said, critical leaders. We've had tremendous support and trusting relationship with municipal leaders in this, in our province. This is, from our perspective, one of the most important of the presentations that we have, because you are so close to the ground, you understand things, and you have such a practical sense of what will work and what next steps we should all be looking at to make this happen. So we're incredibly grateful for your participation. And I say that on behalf of all the people who are part of Engage Nova Scotia, including the board and staff members who are on this call today. So let me touch on what's possible. This is the, from our perspective, a bit of this can be an overwhelming slide in some respects, because it'll begin to tell you, okay, how do you break all of this down? The black bar at the top will show you that we can understand all of these questions if you just want to know by region. And I'll say more about a report that we already have put on our website that shows regions and differences relative to the provincial average on all 230 questions. But by age, income level, gender, disability, et cetera, we have the potential actually to understand people in each of these 8 domains of well-being. The Canadian Index of Wellbeing at the University of Waterloo has been an essential partner for us to create the framework for the 230 questions. It's grouped into these clusters. I think they speak for themselves about their relative importance. I'm sure some of you have been scanning your eye on the kinds of things that would be relevant. I'd love to be able to take you through all of the pieces of this, but I'm going to focus on just one of those domains, and it's the community vitality one that is, from a municipal perspective, from a regional perspective, probably the one that is of greatest relevance to you. So you'll see that all of the questions that are indicated under that community vitality range are critically important to whether or not you and your regions, you and your municipalities have happy, connected, thriving citizens. We have answers in all of these areas, and I'd like to just share with you some early results that we've been able to create in partnership with HRM. So HRM asked us to do some analysis related to the experience of women around issues principally related to community vitality. And they also wanted to see for these women across different income levels, what is their relative response? And you'll see the results that are in front of you here. Those who answer in yellow, if you can read it, I'm not sure if your font is big enough, are those who have incomes reported at over $100,000. For the green font, it is for people between $30,000 and $100,000. And for the blue fonts, you'll see that that's for people who are in poverty, demonstrably under the poverty line. And you'll see that, of course, income is a significant driver in HRM for the results that people have. And again, these are about people's experiences predominantly related to municipal kinds of issues. Some of them, obviously, with respect to people's experience of mental health is a shared responsibility amongst governments and others. But some of them access to recreation and community centers squarely in the realm of the kind of work that you would be responsible for. And going beyond that, I'm just sharing another slide that relates to the results that we got from the work that we've done in collaboration with HRM. These are issues that are about what people's experiences are in their communities. How trusting are they? Do they feel safe? Can they visit parks in their community? Is help available if they need it? So the purpose for us in putting this slide up for you is to say there's a great deal possible. Going back to that earlier slide, this is just in one of the domains where we can begin to understand more deeply what are people's experiences. I should have said at the outset that all these slides are going to be shared with you after today's presentation. So you'll have a chance just to sort of think it through a little bit more as we go along. It's pretty important from our perspective, recognizing that we have all of these regional differences to be able to understand. So what does that mean in those regions? When we at Engage first saw this map of functional economic regions, it was a bit of a hallelujah that we sung. This is created through StatsCan, actually, when they did an analysis of where people live, work, and play. And you'll see that for so long we have had results that sort of express pan-provincial findings for people, which aren't particularly useful, or they might break the province down into 3 regions or 5 regions. And while 10 regions isn't itself perfect, and some of them are large, this at least gets us much closer to to answer the question and build collaborations within each of these regions about what's important for people as we gradually move forward. So I mentioned that we have local leadership teams. Shout out to the community college and its efforts to build our local leadership team network through the leadership of the principals in each of your areas. But they had the support of municipal leaders and RENs and the community health boards and NSH and other community partners, building together the inner circle in the light blue of local leadership teams. But it can't just stay in their minds. They are now trying to imagine, how do we build out people's understanding and capacity to work with what are the findings inside of this information? So we very much want people from the public sector, the community sector, and the business sector to be engaged, as they so often are, to see, okay, what's relevant for our region, and how can we begin to sort of move this from measurement to change for our region. This is critically important. And we want to point to this 4th quadrant of unaffiliated people. If the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that too many people have been left behind and their voices haven't been heard in the full expression of what we want Nova Scotia to become. And so as we begin to sort of reach out in our regions, we want to emphasize the importance of including voices of people who haven't been involved as often in the past. So I'm going to say something more about if you want to become involved or connect with your local leadership team, here's what you need to do. But before I get to that, let me just point to a couple of things that are already available for you and staff in all of these areas. Survey tables that, and I'll be pointing to one of the slides from our March of 2020 survey tables, are already on our website. You would have received a notice just before the pandemic about the launch and release of our first report related to this. It shows answers for all 230 questions with the provincial average and each of the 10 regions of the province beside it, showing what differences and what similarities exist. Local leadership teams that I mentioned before have received summaries, qualitative and quantitative summaries of what's happening. And we've provided, and I'll be pointing to this in a moment, some we're providing some deeper analysis on 6 critical issues that we think are particularly relevant to the times that we are in right now. More to say on what those are. We at Engage are building our capacity to do some analysis for organizations. So the stuff that you just saw with respect to HRM was done through our research coordinator, through the building data analytical skills that we have. And we've been entering into data sharing agreements with NSCC, Dalhousie, the province, and Halifax Partnership, just to name a few of the partners that have signed on, where they have the capacity to do research in-house if they get the files that reveal the fullness of this. We're working on publicly available online tools that everyday citizens would be able to use in order to make this a reality for them. And we also have some research projects that we expect are going to continue to sort of build out for this over time. So you may be left with feeling overwhelmed about, wow, that's a lot, and where do we begin? I'm just going to leave this slide. I'm going to return to it a little bit later on. If you have questions about who to connect with in your region, connect with Haley Vidler on our team at the email address right there. And she will be able to tell you who's involved and how you can connect, or have somebody else from your municipality or REN connect more deeply with this work. If you have questions about the analysis that can be done in your region, Taylor Hill, who's our research coordinator, and her email address is there. And we have a link in our website to research and analysis, can also give you a deeper look at what is possible. So I'm going to just bridge to 2 more themes before we open it up for your questions and comments. The first relates to what are the findings that we've learned so far with respect to this, and lots of ways to slice and dice this, but I'm going to focus on 4 demographic profiles that stood out for us once the Canadian Index of Wellbeing did their analysis. First, it centers on these 16 questions, and so you're going to see the repeat of these 16 questions on a number of occasions. It comes from sort of a general recognition that amongst the 230, and within those 8 domains, there are some that are going to give us early warning signs that things are good or things are challenging. These are the 16 questions that we're using to help us see that through that demographic lens. So you'll see them repeated again here, but this tells you the story of the almost 30% of Nova Scotians who said that they experience, they have a disability or they are experiencing some form of chronic illness. The dark blue line represents the overall response from Nova Scotians, and the light blue line represents residents with disabilities and chronic illnesses. Now you see in each of these 16 questions, the experience of people with disabilities is not as satisfying as it is for people in the population more generally. So this is a key population group that we think we need to close these gaps around. As Bernie was saying earlier, if we're going to begin to put citizens at the center of the work that we're going to do, a baseline of knowing who has been most affected by this is really important. So we would just highlight that this is a demographic group amongst others that warrants some attention. The second thing that you might pay attention to, and you'll see it through the next 3 slides that I'm sharing, in fact, the next 4 slides that I'm sharing, is that the good news is, generally speaking, Nova Scotians consistently report, and this is the case across all regions, high satisfaction with their neighborhoods as a place to live, and the personal relationships they have within them. As you go down to the bottom of this, consistently, people have more concerns, and this is something I think we need to sort of have an honest conversation about. Trust in governments, all governments, is a concern that shows up in the information. Trust in local government, how well democracy works, and other issues that we think are important for you to, as leaders, to be paying attention to. Now, it's not just people with disabilities who have these challenges. People with lower incomes, probably doesn't surprise you, have a marked different experience than those who don't have low incomes, the overall average throughout Nova Scotia. Let's look at single parents. This is probably the area where we were most surprised at the marked difference between the experiences of single parents in all 16 of these questions relative to the provincial average. So what does it mean about the way that we support 70% of them are single moms, single parents, adults with children living at home, in the time stresses that they're feeling, their ability to meet the needs. Most of them are renters. 5 times more of them are renters than owners relative to the provincial average. And we know how much home ownership gives somebody an ability to be anchored in their community and enjoy a better life than otherwise. So I'll just point to one further slide, and this is not this is new residents to Nova Scotia. So to Bernie's point earlier about people making lifestyle changes in deciding to come to Nova Scotia, that's an exciting, fully, truly exciting something. But this slide also points to the need for us, for people who come to Nova Scotia from other parts of Canada or elsewhere for the first time and report within 5 years I've just come to Nova Scotia, their experiences are not as strong as the provincial average. So friendly, welcoming, we need to understand the bridge in that and make sure that our communities are receptive to people in a way that truly reflects what we want to build for our province as a whole. You're going to get the slide that just popped up on your screen. So don't try fully to interpret every piece of it. I'll just point to the repetition of the 16 questions are all contained on the left side. The provincial rating on average ranks the answers to each of those questions, similar to what you would have seen before. And then you'll see that across each of those functional economic regions, there is a different relative ranking for each of those 16 questions. So this is just a snapshot of what you'd want to see. To give you an example of how to read it, I'll just use the comparison between the province as a whole and HRM. And if you can see my icon down at number 8, where people in Nova Scotia generally rank as an 8th out of the full 16, how well they are able to spend their time. In Halifax and HRM, their challenges are greater. And you can see it ranks 10th, and the balance of activities in their daily lives ranks 11th relative to the provincial average of 9. How well do they feel about their financial circumstances? Perhaps not a surprise. They have fewer concerns relative to other people in the province, and so on and so forth. So I won't go through all the details. Perhaps your eyes have already gone to your region of the province to get a quick snapshot of what's there. But this is really essentially intended to animate your thinking about what's possible in this research that could be relevant for you as you continue to move forward. So I'm going to switch a little bit to issues of your institution of local government so that you're better able to understand where you sit relative to other levels of government and what's your relationship with citizens. And this is really high level. So don't take this as a gospel truth. These are just data points. First of all, we asked people about their overall interest in politics. And this I think generally reflects what you sometimes see in voter turnout for federal and provincial elections relative to municipal elections. So perhaps no surprise with respect to this, but provincial government people actually are taking stock of this slide, and federal ones should, of course, too. And this relates to trust in institutions. You'll see that we've listed them, business, NGOs, and then you'll see those first three, that includes local governments, local and municipal, principally municipal governments, having marked higher trust from citizens relative to media and the other two levels of government. So this is a significant, long-standing and trend that has been developing in all of our societies really for a couple of generations. Trust in institutions are dropping, and this is the oxygen that makes it all work. So as you'll recall, many of you, the commitment that Engage we've paid to public engagement. It is centered on our belief that we need to have better relationships between municipalities, all levels of government, but in your case, when we worked with you, municipal parties and citizens, and we need to address this as a challenge. The challenge is greater for the provincial and federal governments, and we will be trying to sort of, in fact, we've got some work now to try to sort of make sure that this becomes a priority for provincial officials as they think about, okay, if we're going to pivot and change and people don't trust us, how does that put us in a paradoxical box that we can't get out of? So again, public engagement is important for many different regions. Building trust is high amongst them. And when we think about who's experiencing those challenges with respect to trust in institutions generally, this graph stood out to us as well. People who have lower incomes have lower trust. Perhaps that's not surprising, but the degree to which this showed up, for me at least, came as a bit of a surprise. The data doesn't show a significant difference across all the regions of the province. I think, frankly, and this is something that it turns up in other elements of this, and we've been candid with our colleagues in Cape Breton, particularly CBRM, about some challenges that do exist around trust in institutions and the long-standing concerns amongst citizens about feeling disaffected. This shows up in this particular slide, but generally speaking, trust in institutions is fairly consistent across all parts of the province. So just to put a wrap on this sort of theme, we've done a cross-section of additional analysis related to 6 different topics, and it shows that these demographic groups that are circled in red are the ones that really stand out. But in each of those columns, you'll see that for social isolation, the experience of women is greater, is more significant. Feelings of trust, men have more of those challenges. So again, you'll see these slides, it reinforces some of what we've shared with you before, which brings us all the way back to the wider context that Bernie was pointing to, and I'll finish with as a theme. And that is that the pandemic has, we believe, been incubating the conditions for potential broad social, economic, and personal change. We believe that where the festering inequities for populations of people are more visible broadly and deeply, and we're now, with that understanding, we should be ready to create the inclusive economy and inclusive societies that will ensure that we are all in this together in ways that, as Nova Scotians, we have remarkably demonstrated over the last 12 months, 10 months. We're also seeing people really, and this I think relates to a trend that started, but it's going into the bigger questions about what matters most to me as an individual. We've gotten increasing signals that people are in the larger questions as individuals as well. And we know that that relates to the notion of improving quality of life. So for many of you who have been part of the Engage Nova Scotia presentations in the past, this slide will look familiar to you. What's different about it is that the slide that we used to share for 5 years used to show results from 2 questions that we asked Nova Scotians back in 2015. On a scale of 1 to 10, we should measure our success by growing the economy. And at that time, we got an answer of 68%. In August of this year, that answer was 58%. And we asked Nova Scotians in 2015, at 58% answering 7, 8, 9, or 10, just to be clear. And similarly, when we asked about whether on a scale of 1 to 10, we should measure success by improving our quality of life, in 2015, it was 81%. In August of this year, it was 82%. We checked this based on people's income, their age, and regions of the province, and it remains consistent that there has been this shift. But let me just pause here for a moment. As Bernie pointed out earlier, these 2 issues are incredibly interdependent. We don't want to set them up as polar opposites. What we are inviting for greater conversation to be about is the opportunity of ensuring that as we grow the economy, the benefits of that growth are going to the people who are not trusting institutions as much, aren't having the opportunity to live the great experience of being in Nova Scotia the way that we know they possibly could. So this brings us to some of the present day work. This slide is one that we built before the pandemic, but it's more relevant now than it ever was before. Young people are choosing place over job increasingly. And we think that as people have moved online, that will be even more apparent. And for rural communities, that will be especially, that creates a particularly interesting opportunity. All the research that is done, including in our research, shows that it's not a universal truth, but in general, people are more satisfied with their lives in rural communities than they are in urban communities. HRM turns out to be a strong happiness community relative to other large centers in Canada. So it's a good news story for Nova Scotia, we think, with a high percentage of communities and people outside of just one concentrated area. So this notion of quality of life is one that we think helps substantially serve the goals that we have around marrying up the social questions with the economic questions. And we're not alone in doing this. I won't spend much time on this slide except to say that this is consistent with what other countries of note have been doing. We've been fortunate to be invited into the conversations because of the uniqueness of the Nova Scotia initiative with some of these other countries on how do we begin to crack this nut. The OECD and now the government of Canada is actually showing particular interest both in this initiative, but also in what's happening in Nova Scotia. And it's partly informed by this. So the UN does its annual review of the happiest countries' life satisfaction. And at a national level, at a global level, there is a strong correlation between advanced economies being generally more having happier people than those that are deeply struggling. So that is part of our intuition around this. But something interesting happens when you just look at those countries, you do a correlation of the 10 happiest countries in the world and which of those countries are leaving fewer people behind. And that inclusive economy, inclusive development index was created by the World Economic Forum, the Davos people. And you'll see a high correlation between those countries that leave fewer people behind and those that have the highest life satisfaction. Back to Bernie's point about what's the wave of the future, or what could we be pointing to as we go about making a better Nova Scotia and being an example to ourselves, most importantly. So I'll leave you with these questions. What does this mean for you? And what needs to happen next? What ideas might this spark for you? And what's unclear? We're not going to get through all of that. We may even end early, I'm not sure. But that's essentially the information that we wanted to share with you and animate for the remaining time that we have, so that we have some questions again from our perspective. it would be really helpful to spend some time in your communities and your regions with all of council / multiple councils being together to share some of this. With enough notice, we should be able to do some analysis that's uniquely of interest to give people some thinking for each of your regions, more to say on how to make that happen. If you were to contact Taylor, and Haley, who's on this call, is also coordinating the regions. With that, perhaps I'll stop sharing my screen and open it up to everyone for questions. I see that the chat function has already started in all of this. Judy, you're going to monitor this?
Yeah, actually, we're going to have Emily moderate, and I think what we agreed on earlier was that if you want to ask a question, raise your hand. I will indicate to Emily that you've got your hand raised, and you can unmute and ask your question. Indicate who it's for, if you don't mind, to either Danny or to Bernie or to both. That would be fantastic.
And your virtual hand. So for those of you who haven't used the hand function, you can raise your real hand. I mean, I can see you all, or most of you. If you hit the participants button in the bottom, and then it'll open a little pane on your right-hand side. And then at the bottom, you'll see a list of names. And right at the bottom, there's 3 buttons: invite, mute me, and raise hand. And if you click raise hand, I'll see it. So I actually see Matt Risser first. So if you'd like to go ahead, feel free.
Thanks. Can everyone hear me? I'm unmuted.
Yes.
Yeah.
You're good.
My question's sort of for both of you, and it's related to conversations that Danny and I have been having for years. So I think the presentations were great from a policy and strategy software perspective, but when I juxtapose that to looking at our institutional and system hardware, it seems like we're setting ourselves up to try and play computer software on a typewriter. And the reason I raise that is because if you look at the literature on institutions and their effect on doing the kinds of things that you guys are talking about, marrying economic growth and social well-being, what Jack Goldstone, the scholar, would call efflorescences, building efflorescences historically, whether it was Venice in the Middle Ages or the Netherlands in the early modern era, or the Nordic countries, or the 10 economies you said now, Danny, that institutions have that critical role to play. And, you know, we've had 6 Ivany reports, and what we've never done is change the institution. So I'm just wondering, you know, how are we going to set ourselves up institutionally for success? What's the plan there?
Bernie, are you ducking underneath your desk there at that question? You're the government.
He's hiding.
Yeah. I know that Bernie has done a lot of, I'll just do a light touch on that, Matt, because it's not Engage's responsibility to reform the institutions of Nova Scotia. And nor is it just the provincial government's responsibility, but the thought leadership that you've provided through so many columns and the like reflect the importance. You know, sometimes people say that we need to recognize whether it's a Model T that we're trying to operate on for some of this. I'll point to this as a uniqueness for the Nova Scotia initiative, and it is that this is not a responsibility of an institution just to deliver on. And a uniqueness of what we have is a collaborative network that is being coordinated by an NGO and not as much by government. I think we're going to iterate forward to see what the respective roles are amongst the different players. That includes municipalities, civil society, as they often say in the international stuff. So I think it will bring about, it will necessitate us to sort of put in context both what's the role of government and other sectors, and also how do each of those sectors change according to the times. I'll turn it over to you, Bernie, now that you're back up.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. I wasn't literally ducking the question, Matt. I was actually reaching down to my floor because I agree completely with you that that institutional arrangements can result in lock-in or path dependency that then limits the range of options available to us. And our institutional arrangements, just like any any jurisdiction was built 20 or 30 years ago, so or earlier, maybe 1867 in some cases, but certainly our economic development institutions were built in the 60s for the industrial era, not for the post-industrial era. So I agree with you completely. And I think that the way institutions change is that people identify the need for change. This question of path dependency and lock-in is a significant challenge. I guess like any problem, awareness is the first step to a solution. What I found the Ivany report was highly effective at doing was focusing attention. And then the next 10 years, and we're not quite 10 years, but it was 2012 that they started their work. Over time, awareness of the need for change started to become more embedded. So I can say, like, I won't defend institutional arrangements broadly speaking, but I recognize that the change that you allude to is a key part that would move in a parallel path with embracing the opportunities of this new era and focusing on quality of life. I think municipalities are important institutions, provincial government are important institutions. To me, the biggest shift we could do in the near term is to start measuring success in terms other than fiscal balance and GDP alone. And I say alone because fiscal balance and GDP have a role to play. But if the measurement of success becomes human-centered and social well-being in a measurable, acceptable way, then the institutions will adapt to achieve that outcome. I hope I'm not being too optimistic in saying that, but I think it's a 10-year journey, and like every journey, it starts with the first step.
Okay, thank you both for those answers. Are you good, Matt? Did you have any follow-up or?
No, that answered my question. I'll leave it to others to wait.
Great. So next up, we have Mayor Murray Scott in Cumberland County. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Bernie, and hi, Danny. Nice to see you again.
Twice.
Nice to see you. And I apologize, I did join a bit late, so maybe what I'm going to ask was already covered. If it was, then you can disregard and move on to someone else. There were a couple things I'm wondering about. I'm wondering about the dates of the survey. Maybe you've already said that, but I'm really curious to when the responses were gathered. Second thing is, do you have a per capita response? For example, some areas of problems like ours in Cumberland have a higher rate of lower income or higher rate per capita of seniors, for example. So when I look at the number of responses, I'm wondering how that relates provincially, but also I'm wondering, obviously locally for us, how that impacts the response you received here. And the third thing is this, and maybe it's incorporated in your survey, maybe it's incorporated in those more general type of sections. I didn't see where he talked about safety in communities. I know he talked about all kinds of issues in communities, but like, you know where I'm at with this, Danny, but safety, something I hear quite often and concern a lot of people in regards to the communities they live in, and that's how they determine where they want to live in this province when they move here from. And we've had them, I'm sure it's the same provincially, but this past year for us, we've had them not only from across this country, but from around the world and moved our small community here, and for all kinds of reasons. So I'm really wondering if safety was part of that, is part of that questionnaire, and if how that fits into the whole thing. Thank you.
Thanks, Murray. Great to see you. And hopefully, if I don't catch all of the questions, then please make sure that I do. So the survey was done in May and June, principally, with a little trickle over into July of 2019. By data captures, that makes it relatively recent, actually, because often we're working with StatsCan information that dates back to 2015 or something because it takes so long to assemble it and such. So we feel good that it's fairly recent. But we're also conscious that it was before the pandemic, and we've done our own informal sort of mental check on how much might things have changed, and there's no way of telling the answers to that. But I'll give you some examples, some of which touch on and are related to the issues that you've shared before. I didn't put on the slide questions about people's confidence in police, schools, justice, and health. And they show concerning signs about people's confidence in the health system, healthcare system in Nova Scotia. Now, our success through the pandemic has obviously been led by healthcare officials. It's not people's experience in the healthcare system, but it's quite possible that that confidence will have grown as a result of people's experience. To your the positive experience that we've had with the pandemic. In terms of the safety issues, I'll just go to that. You can tell through that we actually did ask a robust series of questions. Happy to share the details of those. Some of them came up in the slides that I showed, and you will receive shortly, about people's feeling safe, walking at nights, and those sorts of things. But there's much more around public safety that can be asked and answered as a result of this. Confidence in policing, which would be near and dear to your heart, was high at the time. It was clearly the highest of the 4 institutions that we had asked people to answer questions about. And in terms of the weighting, we did, I think that's the essence of your question about is it representative, is that the research has been weighted according to age, by region, and by gender. As often happens in these, a higher number of older Nova Scotians, older people, answer these kinds of surveys. And so we've taken that into account as we created the balance of what would exist, and did tabulations about what regional questions and differences are. So as you get to smaller populations of people, so in your regions, we won't be able to do as much by way of fine analysis for smaller sample groups than we could for 13,000 people, but there's still in every region meaningful and significant information that we'll be able to disaggregate to tell you a story on questions that are really important and have never been known before. So those are pieces of that excitement around some of that weighting and regional dimension of it.
That's great. Thank you very much, Danny.
Thank you, Mayor, for your question. So I don't have any more hands, but I do have Councillor Paula Huntley from Kentville indicated in the chat she had a question. So go ahead,
Thank you so much. I'm enjoying this today. I just wanted to go back on one of the screens, which I found really interesting. It was a screen you had done on the quality of life in women in the HRM by income. And it started at 30, and then it went to 30,000 to 100,000, and then of course over 100,000. What I'm wondering is the 30 to 100, that's such a gap. Later on, you showed another screen, which I absolutely loved, because the screen in each level went by $10,000. And what I wonder is, would the quality of life in women within HRM by income shown us something different if it was that 30 to 100, not such a gap? Like, there's got to be at some point between 30 and 100, you would think that maybe their minds would have changed, whether it was friendly neighborhoods or just safety where they walk, you know, things like that. That's all I'm wondering. What was the choice between why do 30 to 100? Because if you think the other question on the money piece, sorry, Danny, was that when you show 30,000, is that what they make or is that what they take home? Because obviously then that will give a different feel as well.
You're muted, Danny.
Okay, I'll stop muting. Thanks, Paula. So we can make those gradations at whatever levels. I'm trying to remember, it's not locked into those quadrants. We ask a series of questions that HRM self-selected to be this. We can change the brackets. In fact, for a presentation we're doing tomorrow for the Creative Council and the arts community. We're changing the brackets to reflect some of what you talked about, that there's the HRM ones, we found the same thing. And that's a pretty wide gap. It was their choice. We're going to narrow that, and we might be able to do it into 4 or 5 gradations to tell us more. It just depends on what you'd like.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, were there any other questions from folks that are still sticking around? And I'm sorry, you can probably hear my baby in the background, so that's what that is.
I'm not.
She's really cute.
I'm not seeing any. Oh, here we have something
Oh, do we have another hand?
in the chat.
Oh. Okay, too much background noise. I hear that. Okay. So the question from Joe Swinimer is, I'm Community Development Coordinator with East Hants. From the map, we are clearly combined with HRM, but we wondered why. Okay, so that's speaking to the functional economic region. So I can turn that over to Danny or Bernie, whoever.
And maybe I can lead off. The way in which a functional economic region is determined by Stats Canada is looking at the data that they have on where people both live and work. So it's pretty accessible data in the sense that most workers would be filing tax returns with their principal address and their place of employment. So when they look at that data, and 75% of the population live and work within a geographic area, and there's not absolute precision to this, but when they do, we can draw additional conclusions from that. That's likely, in addition to living and working, that's where they socialize, that's where they have networks, that's where there's contacts and connections and so forth. And it extends beyond municipal boundaries or historic boundaries that may be related to previous eras or confederation and when the lines were drawn back then. So it has no significance other than trying to be a capture of what constitutes a community using kind of a human-centered approach where people live, work, play, interact, socialize, and that's the reason. And when the data is done for Nova Scotia, the area that is defined within Halifax and Hants would have a representation of 75% of the population live and work within that circle.
If I could add, sorry for the typing sound in the background there a moment ago. If we were to focus in on East Hants itself, this was actually a question that came from your member of parliament. And if I'm remembering correctly, again, here are the 2 types of questions we've gotten. Some municipalities that have said, we just want to know for our municipality what the answers are. It's possible to get some of that, but the reliability and the weighting becomes more of a concern as you get down to populations, say, of 10,000 people, as opposed to, you know, most of you in those regions start at 30,000 or so and move up, and that just creates more reliability. More reliability in the response rates. But with some focus and attention, it may be possible to, if the population is big enough, to work with our researchers to carve out something that's different than the functional economic regions with the results that we have. So it's all not lost. And if this is an interest, Joe, then just reach out to Taylor and we can have a conversation about that.
Great. Great answers.
Joe has responded in the chat.
Yes, yeah, so I think she agrees. She says, yeah, it makes sense. So there you go. That's great. Anything further for our presenters today? Danny wanted 30 seconds to make a pitch for some follow-up meetings. So go ahead, Danny, and then I'll close things off if we're there, which I think we are.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I want to say this on behalf of all the engaged folk who have worked with you. We really appreciate your time. You're all very busy, and you've made a choice to sort of connect to this combined presentation. And from our perspective, it's a bit of it creates an opening, but we would love to be able to move the conversation to your regions of the province and to engage councils or better collections of councils together. We've done that in, Lenny, you'll recall, in Pictou County a while back. We've got upcoming presentations to municipalities, sometimes in one-offs and sometimes as a larger group. We've been talking with Amanda, who I think is on the call, about having a presentation to all of CBRM. So there's much more to be done, and we would love to have that next conversation and to have the Wrens in on the conversation and whoever else can be. The LLTs, the local leadership teams, have been waiting for us to have this conversation so that they can begin to express their belief in this locally and the possibilities for municipal support to be part of the large collection that they're looking to build out. So I'm going to put my email address in the chat, or you'll probably see it from everywhere else, just so that you know if you didn't get those earlier pieces about our colleagues, then I can't do two things at one time, it seems. Then we hope that you find a way to reach out to us and to the local folks to find out more. So thanks again.
Thanks, Danny. So just, I guess this is a wrap. So I just wanted to say thank you. And yes, that, the baby's crying. She's gonna diaper change. I don't have to do it. This was great timing. So it's perfect, actually. So I just wanted to say thank you to both of you for your time today and for connecting with the Department of Municipal Affairs and with NSFM to spend your afternoon with us, and to everyone who participated. Thank you. And to Judy, who's our event lady, and certainly works hard behind the scenes to get everybody set up and registered. We appreciate certainly all that you do as well. So unless there was anything else anyone wanted to add, I wish you all a wonderful Thursday. And thank you again so much for being here and for sharing those insights. And I speak from the heart. Reach out to Danny, and he can hook you up with some great data and have some great conversations. So thank you all.